Today I'll start a new project, a rounded and backed cased book. This was the first full book I made a YouTube video about, and it's time I gave it a refresh. I'll make the book in 4 videos. In this video I'll fold and sew the sections. In the second video I'll round and back and line the spine. Next video I'll make the case. The final video will be casing in and maybe looking at some labelling options. As usual, I'll leave explaining and providing other background information that requires a bit of yakking for while I'm doing the repetitive tasks. Let's get started by folding some paper. I'm going to do 16 sections of 4 sheet sections. The paper is 80 GSM Clare book and I'll use 18-3 linen thread. For this book, it's important to get the swell right, and I'm aiming for between 25 and 30% swell. Swell is the thickening of the spine edge of the book block due to the added thickness of the sewing thread inside the sections. If you're unfamiliar with what swell is, I have a video where I take a detailed look at it, which you might like to check out. I'll count out all the sections first, then fold them. I just find this a bit faster. I slightly fan out the stack of paper to make it easier to lift individual sheets, and I count out 3 sections at a time. The friend that showed me this technique had a lifetime of production experience and could do 4 sections at a time and was lightning fast without using the 4x editing tool. I prefer folding from left to right. I line up the corners and then make the crease at the spine going out from the centre of the fold. This way, if there's any stretch of the paper, it's distributed in both directions. I crisp up the fold with the bone folder, flip the section and repeat. I flip the section back to the original orientation and place it in the folded pile. I follow this set of steps for all paper. For blank paper, it doesn't matter if the orientation gets a bit mixed up, but printed sections, you need to keep them in order. It's just better to get into a good habit. When I use the bone folder, I try and only make contact right at the fold. A hard bone folder can noticeably polish softer papers. I normally add a little step which I've demonstrated in other videos where I fan the pages slightly to the right before folding. This compensates for page creep on the outer sheets. For blank paper it makes little difference, but for printed material it helps keep registration. This is not the perfect book structure, but it's one of my favourites. I think it's the best book for people new to bookbinding to study so you can understand many of the key aspects of how a book works. The cased book is such an important book structure that I've made an overview video about it, but I'll give you a quick version here. Until the early 19th century, all the steps in making a book were sequential. The book was sewn, boards attached, the book covered, and finally decorated or finished. The Industrial Revolution transformed all trades. Production of materials sped up, and post the Industrial Revolution there started a shift in demographics with a growing educated middle class which drove a demand for books. The period around 1820 saw the invention of wood pulp paper and book cloth, which broke the reliance on linen, cotton, hemp-based handmade paper and leather as a covering material. Suddenly, materials became cheaper and available in larger quantities, and printing became turbocharged, well, at least steam-powered. Together with the increase in demand, the bookbinder was the meat in the sandwich. Another way of folding is to push the foredge of the paper into a straight edge to keep the sheets in alignment. The back of a bench hook is perfect. The response bookbinders came up with was to break the sequential manufacturing process. In the cased book, the cover, known as the case, and the book block can be made in parallel, and the two brought together in the step called casing in. This dramatically sped up book production. In the 19th century, bookbinding was heavily unionised and segmented. Many people became involved in the production of a book. Along with the invention of machines to automate many steps, including sewing, the number of books being produced dramatically increased by the end of the 19th century. The rounded and backed cased binding became the dominant binding structure. Once I've folded 16 sections, I'll put them in the nipping press overnight. I'll rotate half the sections to even out the pressure due to the folds. This is often described as pressing the air out of the sections. I'm not sure this is the most technically accurate description, but it certainly does make the book block more solid. When I'm teaching this book in person, I sometimes skip this step completely or just put the sections in the press for a count of 10. Next, I'll mark the spine for sewing. I'll put the sections between the boards I'm going to use to cover the book and knock up to the head and spine and put it in a finishing press so that the spine sticks out about 2 centimetres or roughly an inch. I'll mark the kettle stitch locations 12mm in from each end. If I'd folded up large sheets into sections and knocked up to the head, the tail would be more uneven, and I would mark the tail kettle stitches in 15mm to give some extra trimming margin. For an A5 sized book, I think 2 supports is fine, and I'll sew on 2 stiffened cotton tapes 12mm wide. I'll space these evenly and make marks about 1mm either side of the tapes. I'll transfer the marks to a hooked punching template to pre-punch the sewing holes. This is my preferred method of punching sewing holes, but I know some people like using punching cradles. I'm using a new finishing press today. My Wiesner press survived the flood despite going underwater with a book in it, which I had to chisel out. But since a Wiesner press isn't available to everyone, I wanted to find a press that I liked that is. Schmet has offered to sponsor some future Daz bookbinding Q&A videos, and as part of this they sent me this press. I'm really liking this press and can say right away that I'd recommend one if you're in the market, but I'll do a proper review of it in the future. I'll make the punching template from some lightweight card. It doesn't need to be exactly what I'm using, but I'm using a 300 GSM card, which would be the equivalent of a 10-point card in the US. I cut a piece longer than the book and about 10 centimetres or a few inches wide. The stiffness of the card means you can push it into the fold of the section, which consolidates the sheets, and hook it over the head, which keeps the sheets aligned at the head. I put a piece of corrugated cardboard on the bench to give me something to punch into, and I hold the sections open at roughly a right angle, and I punch through the fold at 45 degrees. If you are sewing on made end papers, you need to punch the holes for these slightly differently. I've shown this in other videos and will show it again in a video I'll do on a sewn on end paper variation of this binding. I can punch all the sections in less than 3 minutes, and I'm sure it saves me more than 3 minutes in sewing. You don't need to pre-punch the sewing holes. It is possible to sew just by eye, and a lot of the trade work done by professional women sewers was probably done this way. I'm not as good as they were. In general, I don't saw in kerfs, except occasionally for the kettle stitches, and of course always for recessed cords. I'm using 18-3 linen thread. This means that it's 3 strands of 18 Li thread made of flax. There may be a few of you that don't know what a Li is. The Li of linen thread is the number of yards in a pound of linen divided by 300. I'm not kidding. So a pound of linen thread of 18 Li would be 5,400 yards long. I like to buy my linen in 50-gram skeins. So with a quick conversion of pounds to grams and yards to metres in my head, and don't forget it's 3-ply, a 50-gram skein has about 180 metres of linen thread. It's also just over 0.5 millimetre thick, or 20 thou if you work in inches. Sewing is straightforward. I'll sew from back to front. I'll place the sections so I can take one off the top, open it up and place it in a fairly efficient manner. There's no need to use a sewing frame when sewing a single book on 2 stiffened tapes. I do put the sections on a piece of wood to make it easier to sew. You can use a stack of pressing boards or another book. I start sewing by going into the head kettle stitch location and working my way in and out to the tail. Position the tapes and pull the thread tight, always pulling the thread in the direction of the fold to not cut the paper. I add the second section and work my way back to the head. To join the first 2 sections at the head, I'll tie a reef or a square knot. If it ends up being a granny knot, that's fine. We're not mountain climbing. This is how I was taught, and it's in the classic texts, and it's fast and works. However, I have since learned something new from Kathy Abbott, which I consider next level binding, and I'll demonstrate that in the video on adding a sewn end paper to this book. Getting back to the type of thread, I recommend not buying pre-waxed thread. It's far too waxy and the wax will just get on your paper. Some of the stuff on the interweb about how essential waxed thread is for bookbinding makes my eyes roll so hard I get dizzy. Crafty All Day 443 wants to try bookbinding but can't find waxed thread. What can they do? Just use unwaxed thread. If you can't find linen thread, just use cotton or polyester. The main thing is you need sufficient thickness of thread to get the swell you need. If your thread is too thin, you can double or even quadruple it. Having said that, I did run my thread over some beeswax a couple of times, mainly to get the twist out of it to prevent knots while sewing and because I like the smell of beeswax. There is another minor reason, more bookbinding related, which I'll save for another day. It's subtle. At the end of the third section, you do the first kettle stitch to attach the section to the block. I find beginners can get a bit hung up on the kettle stitch. You can keep it simple and do what I do and swing the needle between the two sections below the one being added and bring the needle up through the loop made. I don't poke the needle through as there is a chance you'll stick it through the paper and maybe your finger if it's waiting to receive it. If you want to assert your individuality, you can go from the outside to inside. The result is a mirror image and it's fine if you want to do that. I would not skip going up through the loop. This locks the knot and it's not really a kettle stitch if you don't. This is often described as a non-locking kettle stitch, and in some bindings, such as the crisscross binding, it is helpful in tensioning the thread between the sections. But in this binding, it helps in maintaining the tension throughout the sewing. I've also seen people go down through the loop, which adds an extra half twist to the knot. I have experimented with this to see if it's a way to stop over-tightening the sewing. I found it often produced time-consuming knots and uneven tension across the row of kettle stitches. But some people just want to be different, and if going down through the loop is what you want to do, then go ahead. Once you run out of thread, you add more using the weaver's knot. Check out the video on bookbinding knots if you need instructions on this or the little trick I use to keep the needle on the thread. If you're struggling with the weaver's knot, you have my blessing to use any knot you know that doesn't slip. I'm doing the knots over the tapes, which has the risk of showing through the spine covering material. You can put the knots inside the sections, but some people don't like the very slight chance of someone seeing the knot inside the book. I slightly favour putting the knot inside the sections. If during sewing you think the swell is building up too much, you can use a bone folder to press some of the swell out. Doing this, you can embed the thread into the paper a bit and maybe even flatten the thread inside the sections slightly. It's just best to use the right thread thickness for the paper thickness and number of sheets, but you can make adjustments. Once sewing is complete, you can hold the block in a finishing press and lay it on the bench at the edge and knock some swell out with a hammer. Having a peek into the future, we can see the block ends up 20 millimeters thick at the foredge and a bit over 25 millimeters thick at the spine. Perfect. The most common mistake that people new to bookbinding make with this binding is over-tightening the sewing, especially pulling the kettle stitches too tight. The kettle stitches are a row of knots across the spine that makes a continuous connection between the sections. In the next video, we're going to round the spine of the book and back it, add shoulders. That row of kettle stitches is going to go around a curve that is slightly wider than the book is now. The row of kettle stitches are going to have to stretch a bit to do this. If they've been pulled too tight to within an inch of their life, they won't stretch, and it's going to make rounding and backing difficult. If after sewing the spine of the book looks like a banana, the sewing is too tight. A trick I learnt from Michael Burke, which helps prevent over-tightening the kettle stitches, is to hold the sections down a small distance, maybe 1 or 2 centimetres, 1/4 to 1/2 an inch, behind the kettle stitch. Don't put your thumb down right over the back of the row of kettle stitches. This allows the sections to lift up before the knot is over-tightened. When you start and there are fewer sections, your thumb is a bit closer and you move it away as you add sections, as more sections provide more resistance. To finish sewing, I'll simply do 2 kettle stitches in the same location. I think this is the most commonly taught and best documented finish. I've seen many variations to finish, and I might look at a couple of these in the sewn on end paper video. I think the goal is to reduce the size of the knot so it's less likely to show through the spine covering material. The reality is that once the spine is glued, this knot is not coming undone, and I'm sure a single kettle stitch would be fine. I'll finish up with sewing today. In the next video, I'll glue the spine, trim the edges, round and back, and finally line the spine. Part 3 will be making the case, and Part 4 is casing in. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you're able and want to, you can support the making of more videos like this through Patreon or with a one-off contribution, and the details are in the description below. To find videos I've made on specific topics or other projects, the best place to go is the Daz Bookbinding Video Guide. It's the index to the channel, and there's a link in the description below. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button and select the notification bell. Until next time, cheerio.